Today, our focus is on abdominal aortic aneurysm, or AAA.
Right.
And this is a condition where finding it early really directly saves lives. I mean, the mortality rate if one of these ruptures is over 80%.
It's a staggering number.
So let's start with that definition. How do we strictly define an AAA, and where do we usually find them?
So an AAA is a permanent localized dilation of the abdominal aorta. The number to remember is a diameter of 3.0 centimeters or greater.
3.0, that's the line.
That's the line. Or if you don't have a baseline, you can think of it as more than 1.5 times the normal diameter. And anatomically, something like 80% of them are infrarenal below the kidney arteries.
And we mentioned that 80% mortality rate. What makes a rupture so uniquely dangerous?
Well, it's the immediate clinical catastrophe. I mean, these are often completely asymptomatic. They just silently grow.
So no warning signs?
Often no. And then when a rupture happens, it's a massive acute hemorrhage. You really don't get a second chance, which is why detection is everything.
Let's talk about who we should be looking for. Which patient groups face the highest risk here?
It's very much a disease of sex and age. The prevalence really takes off in men over the age of 60.
Over 60.
Yep. And the peak incidence where we see the most new cases is between 70 and 80 years old. And the difference between sexes is stark. It's 4 to 6 times higher in men than in women.
4 to 6 times.
Sure.
Wow. Okay, so when we're counseling these at-risk patients, what are the biggest factors, both modifiable and non-modifiable?
The strongest modifiable risk factor, without a doubt, is smoking.
Always comes back to smoking.
It always does. It doesn't just help it form, it makes it grow faster and increases the rupture risk. Then you have the non-modifiable factors. Male sex, older age, and a family history and a first-degree relative.
Okay, that makes sense. But I read something interesting here, a kind of paradox with traditional cardiovascular risks.
Yes. Diabetes is actually negatively associated with both its development and its growth.
Negatively. So having diabetes might actually be protective.
That's what the data suggests, yeah.
So let's get into the mechanics. What is actually happening at a cellular level that makes the aortic wall so weak?
It's essentially a complex, chronic, inflammatory process. The aortic wall starts remodeling itself, but in a destructive way.
How so?
Well, you have these key structural proteins, elastin and collagen, and they get broken down by enzymes called matrix metalloproteinases, or MMPs.
So the body's own enzymes are attacking the structure.
Precisely. And this is all fueled by chronic inflammation. You see lots of lymphocytes and macrophages in the vessel wall. On top of that, the smooth muscle cells start to die off apoptosis, which thins the wall even more.
And once that weakening begins, I imagine physics takes over. How does the biomechanical stress make it worse?
That's where the law of Laplace comes in. It's a perfect example.
Okay, refresh my memory.
The law states that wall tension is proportional to the radius. So as the aorta dilates, the radius gets bigger.
Right.
And as the radius increases, the tension on that already weak wall increases. This causes more dilation, which increases the tension further. It's a textbook vicious cycle.
Which really highlights why we need to find these early. So let's talk screening.
The gold standard for screening and for surveillance is the duplex ultrasound. For that highest risk group men, aged 65 to 75, who have ever smoked, the recommendation is a one-time screening ultrasound. That's a grade B recommendation.
And grade B is a strong recommendation, right? It means the benefit is pretty clear.
Very strong. And it's important to define ever smoked. The guideline says that means 100 or more cigarettes in a lifetime.
100 cigarettes. Got it. What about men in that age group who've never smoked?
For them, it's a grade C recommendation. So screening isn't routine, but you can offer it selectively if they have other big risk factors, like a family history.
And what about for women?
The guidelines are much stricter. For women 65 to 75 who smoked, the evidence is insufficient. That's a grade I. And for women who never smoked, it's recommended against, a grade D.
So the real focus for screening has to be on that high-risk male population.
Overwhelmingly, yes.
Okay, so most EAs are asymptomatic. But if they're not ruptured yet, what are some of the subtle symptoms that might point to rapid expansion?
You might hear a patient describe a chronic abdominal or lower back pain, kind of a gnawing feeling. That should be a red flag.
A gnawing pain.
Yes. And another thing to look for is thromboembolic events. Little bits of clot from inside the aneurysm can break off and travel downstream. The classic example is blue toe syndrome.
Right. Now, for the worst case scenario, rupture. What's the classic presentation we're all taught, and why can't we always rely on it?
The classic triad is severe acute abdominal or back pain, a pulsatile abdominal mass, and then hypotension or syncope.
The textbook case.
The textbook case, exactly. The problem is you see that full triad in less than 50% of patients who actually have a rupture.
Less than half. That is a huge potential for misdiagnosis.
A massive one. Ruptured A gets misdiagnosed all the time as, kidney stones or diverticulitis or just bad back pain.
So what's the bottom line for someone in the ER?
The bottom line is this. Any elderly patient who comes in with syncope or undifferentiated back or abdominal pain, especially with risk factors, you have to have a rupture on your differential. That high index of suspicion is what saves their life.
Let's pivot to management. For the ones we find, incidentally, when they're so small, say less than 5.5 centimeters, what's the plan?
It's all about conservative management. This means aggressive risk factor modification.
So stopping smoking.
Absolutely mandatory. Plus, tight blood pressure control, putting them on a statin, and antiplatelet therapy. Now, all these things are great for their overall cardiovascular health, but it's important to know they don't actually shrink the aneurysm.
They don't shrink it. So surveillance is key. What does that schedule look like based on the size?
It's a tiered approach. So for the smallest ones, 3.0 to 3.9 centimeters, we do an ultrasound every 3 years.
Every 3 years, okay.
Once it gets to 4.0 to 4.9 centimeters, we tighten that up to an ultrasound every 12 months. Right. And then when it hits 5.0 to 5.4 centimeters, we're in the home stretch. That requires an ultrasound or a CT every 6 months.
Okay, those are very clear intervals. Now, for repair, what are the absolute diameter thresholds where you refer a patient for surgery?
For men, the established number is 5.5 centimeters or greater. At that point, the risk of rupture outweighs the risk of the operation.
5.5 for men.
Yes. But, and this is critical, for women, the threshold is lower. 5.0 centimeters.
That half a centimeter seems like a small difference, but I'm guessing it's incredibly important.
It's a life-saving distinction. Women tend to have smaller aortas to begin with, so they have a higher rupture risk at smaller diameters. If you use the 5.5 rule for everyone, you are putting your female patients at serious risk.
Good to know. Are there other triggers for repair regardless of size?
Yes. Rapid expansion is a big one. We define that as growth of more than half a centimeter in 6 months. Also, any new symptoms, like that gnawing pain we talked about. And finally, the shape matters. A saccular or pouch-like aneurysm has a higher rupture risk than the more common fusiform shape, so that would also prompt a referral.
Let's talk about the two main repair options, endovascular or EVAR, and open surgical repair, OSR. How do they compare on perioperative mortality?
EVAR is a less invasive approach, right? It uses stents. It has a much lower perioperative mortality rate, somewhere in the range of 0.5 to 2%.
Very low.
Very. OSR is the big traditional open surgery. It's a lot more stress on the body, so the mortality rate is higher, between 3 and 5%.
So if EVAR is safer in the short term, why would anyone choose the open repair? What's the trade-off?
Durability. That's the trade-off. OSR is, for the most part, a one-and-done fix. The graft is incredibly durable, and you typically don't need long-term imaging.
It's a permanent solution.
Pretty much. EVAR, on the other hand, requires lifelong surveillance. You have to keep checking for problems like leaks or the device moving, and it has a higher rate of needing re-intervention down the road.
Okay, let's focus on those EVAR complications. What's the main thing we need to watch for?
The big one is something called an endoleak.
An endoleak.
Yes. It's when blood is still flowing into the original aneurysm sac, just outside the stent graft. If that flow repressurizes the sac, the rupture risk is still there.
And just to be complete, what are the main complications with the open repair?
With OSR, the complications are more about the systemic stress of the surgery. Things like myocardial infarction, renal failure, ischemic colitis, or graft infection. So, to synthesize this for the general practitioner, the priority is really clear. You need to identify those at-risk men 65 to 75 for that one-time ultrasound.
Right.
And then just be aggressive about modifying their cardiovascular risk factors, especially getting them to stop smoking.
So what's the final thought here? For every clinician, especially in an urgent or emergency setting, you just have to maintain a high clinical suspicion for a ruptured AAA.
Absolutely.
Any elderly patient with syncope or that non-specific back pain, it has to be on your mind. Remember, that classic triad is often missing. The caution you use today is what saves a life tomorrow. It's about realizing that the patient you rule out might just be the one you saved.